Right, we're good. Okay, great. Apologies. Sorry about that, everybody. We're up and running now. So I was just saying welcome to our first social exclusion seminar of the term. Tammy is managing the online room. My name's Laura and I'll be here managing the in-person room. Just a bit of housekeeping, which we all should be familiar with now, is to remain muted if you can online, unless you have a kind of point of clarification, in which case if you could contact Tammy. There will be plenty of time at the end for discussion. We're very delighted to welcome Dr. Berkay Ozcan, who's an Associate Professor of Social Policy here at LSE, and also the Programme Director for the BSc in Social Policy and Economics.
That one's updated.
Okay.
I'm a PhD Programme Director.
Oh, and PhD Programme Director now. Berkay is a social demographer working at the intersection between family processes and child and economic outcomes to understand social stratification. Much of his work is inherently interdisciplinary, passing across demography, population economics, and sociology. And we're delighted that today he's come to speak to us about some work investigating the relationship between intergenerational family ties and financial incentives. So I'll hand straight over to you to crack on with that.
Thank you so much for having me here today. This is an ongoing work co-authored with Professor Viola Angelini and Professor Joan Costafont. He's at the Department of Health Policy, also acting affiliate of CASE. This is a project that we've been working on and off before pandemic and on pockets of time. So it's a very slow moving but ongoing project that we still didn't have right up our some of the new results. So I look forward to having any input or interaction. Like if you want to interrupt me for clarification questions, I'll be more than happy. I'm used to being interrupted. The motivation and background is this: there's a lot of increasing demand in Europe when it comes to population aging discussion as one of the social problems about loneliness. And then there's this portrayal of the loneliness crisis that is happening also within the UK, but especially in some of the Central European countries. And within that context, people have investigated from the aging and sociology literature whether children's contact can it be really related to incentivize or can be a target for the policymakers. Children's contact has been found in the sociology and demography literature to alleviate loneliness and improves the well-being of elderly. I think much of these, what I say, is going to become obvious for most people. But there are actually studies that are showing that the well-being scores have been going up and highly correlated with the grandparents when they have more children with their grandchildren as well as their adult children. A very long literature in economics have thought about financial incentives, bequests, and gifts as important predictors of contact with family members. They go all back to 1970s Becker's theoretical papers that they talk about. And then there's an old, very seminal paper by Bernheim. He has written a series of papers from the economist's point of view, how bequests are actually tools for families to increase social contact and the ties with the children. So this is quite an old literature, but it's very formal theoretical literature from the economics discipline. And the new empirical literature is non-causal from the sociology discipline. What we want to fill here as a gap is try to bring causal analysis in the empirical literature rather than a theoretical literature. So the contact with children is argued to be an important saving motive. There's a separate paper on Koplikoff and Summers, that's 1981. There's a follow-up paper in 2007 that shows that parents, when they have higher levels of contact with their children and grandchildren, they end up saving more. Their savings behavior extend to beyond the retirement ages, deviating from the typical life cycle saving theories. But there's very little evidence, causal evidence, whether actual financial incentives or any policy scope for increasing social contact between the adult children and older parents, especially from Europe. There's a long list of studies from the US, and the studies in the US focused on inheritances, which I will explain why this happens in the historical process. And the discussions centered around the existence of a bequest motive. So these are seminal papers that I cite, a series of them. One reason is that in the US, you are allowed to bequest or inherit your entire wealth to your dog, if you like. So there is no statutory protection laws in the US. So this entire free will of leaving your entire inheritance to anyone related or unrelated to your family members, made the researchers to be interested in understanding why do people inherit certain portion of their wealth to specific offsprings versus others. So the literature has proliferated around the US discussions about bequest motive and why do people save. They want to bequest it to a specific child, but it hasn't really spilled over too much to Europe because for very obvious reasons, in Europe, there is very little that unequal bequest occurs among the offsprings of the families. And in most families and in most legal systems in Europe, there's statutory laws that that prevents parents to leave their inheritances to random people. A certain portion of the inheritances has to go through compulsorily to the offspring of the families. These laws are quite prevalent across European countries, but there's also a strong cultural norm to leave inheritances equally across the children. When the parents leave equally their inheritance to their children, as a very strong norm, which I will show in the data that happens, then what parents have in terms of financial tools to incentivize contact is actually giving financial gifts while they're alive rather than after death. So we want to look at here in the European context to see whether strategic inter vivo transfers while people are alive using the large sums of gifts to elucidate some contact, social contact with their children in the European settings. And the absence of studies in Europe is regrettable because gifts actually in Europe are quite important. They accrue more than 10% of their children's, all of people's children's net worth, and according to some studies that are getting updated. And inheritance, as statutory laws regulates in inheritance Europe in a very different way, and generating a lot of incentives that the gifts are much less taxed and controlled or monitored while the parents are alive to transfer to the children than actually bequests and inheritance taxes. So this generates a policy problem for policymakers if they want to look at the transfer of intergenerational wealth mobility or transfer of wealth across generations. It's rather done when the parents are alive than when the parents die. And also, Europe makes it particularly suitable to context to study this strategic gift giving because there's larger cross-sectional variation across European countries, both in terms of social contact and in terms of family norms, and also attitudes towards altruistic behavior, as well as differences in legislations in terms of taxes. So we thought that we would be filling a gap by studying this context and phenomenon in Europe using share data. So what we do is we basically show that in a bunch of descriptive statistics that the bequests in most part of Europe actually distributed among children equally. While that's being done, gifts are not distributed equally. We see a greater deal of variation in gifts. And we adopt a child's perspective, and the share data allows us, rather than adult's perspective, and rather than parents' perspective. But when I use the term child throughout the talk, I talk about the adult children rather than the children. So adopting from an adult children's perspective to contact with the elderly parents, and then we want to understand their strategic behavior, whether receiving gifts rather than parents giving gifts, whether they're receiving gifts increases their social contact with their parents. So that's the perspective that we use. So what we do is we exploit the effect of changes in gifts. What we need in exogenous variation in that behavior that is not really conditioned on every family's unique relationships that is happening between the parents' circumstances and the children's circumstances. So what we find is basically inheritance taxes actually facilitate the amounts of gift given to be varying across the countries and across the groups as the taxation changes happened in Europe in a large set of countries. So I'll explain a bit more because the logic is slightly complex. The idea is basically when the inheritance taxation increases in countries, the amount of inheritance reduces. So from the children's perspective, the expectations of what might be receiving at the end of the parent's life might be smaller or larger if the taxes increase or reduce. And then that also gives incentives for the grandparents or like elderly parents to decide about maybe not lose the money to the taxation and then give them while they're alive. So we use that exogenous source of variation in tax legislation changes across European countries over time to see whether gift-giving amounts and behavior is affected by them. And then if it's affected by them, does it really generate any response in terms of social contact in the children? So that's what we do. So we use a sample of adult children of individuals of age 50 plus, because that's the sampling framework for the Survey of Health and Aging and Retirement in Europe survey share data between 2004 and 2015. And share data has 3-4 waves over that period. It's not very frequent, it's not annual. And it covers a large set of countries. And then we will be showing that across these countries, some of them have made dramatic changes in their tax legislation on inheritance. Some countries didn't, and then we'll use some of those variation across countries over time. So we find that we find robust evidence that presence of a strategic gift behavior. And I'll start with showing descriptive evidence first, and then more causal evidence, and I'll present a bunch of slides about, can we think about this alternatively, whether the parents is unhealthy, whether what happens when they're stepchildren, and so on. So we'll make this story more interesting as we go along. So there's actually a few more recent studies about that. So outside of Europe as well. So the Lee finds evidence of exchange as opposed to altruism in explaining family transfers in China, which regulates so-called filial piety. It's a term, it exists in Europe only, I think in Germany. Jakob, you can confirm it. So that Germany has actual filial piety laws. Like it's the only country, as far as I know, in Europe that obliges the adult children to look after the parents in case parents fall into poverty. Other than that, most European countries don't have filial piety laws. And much of my aging demographer colleagues were surprised to hear about a law as such existing even in Germany. So it's not very common concept, and that's not commonly shared across European countries, the legal obligation or financial obligation to look after the parents, but there's more cultural and moral concept that is quite commonly shared across European countries with varying degrees that the parents and children do have a social contact that is for altruistic and care reasons and so on. So motivations might differ also across the income distribution. Altruism might be more prevalent, according to one study, among low-income parents rather than high-income parents. And the cross-country differences may also occur in how children react to these changes in gifts and contacts, depending on where they are in the income distribution. So we look at not only the average effects, but we also look at some distributional aspects of the wealth and gift giving. So this is the first descriptive slide. What we do here is basically use the share data and look at the social contact frequency variables on the y-axis on the corner graph, and then the average amount of gift given on the x-axis in all three graphs. And then here the likelihood of share of co-residing people with their parents, elderly parents, and here that shows the distances measured in kilometers living to the parents, and all three graphs are plotted against the amount of gift given. So what we could say is more or less in countries, the social contact increases where the average amount of across countries where the average amount of gift increases. So co-residence decreases as the average amount of gift increases, or the other way around. You may say that the people who don't co-reside, they tend to receive more gifts. And then as the people live further away from their parents, they are most likely to receive gifts. So there is this descriptive evidence that you can say that the gifts are negatively correlated with the distance and positively correlated with social contact across the countries. So our empirical strategy also relies on one important assumption that says, well, the inheritance tax legislation shouldn't change the inheritance motives. It should change only the gift motives. Otherwise, we won't be identifying our results. So to start with that premise is that we want to show that actually, no matter what, over time periods, in Europe, there's a very strong norm against discriminating children when it comes to inheritances and bequests. And we have the shares end of life survey, which shows that unlike in the US, where the rate of 60% of unequal bequests, bequests are equally distributed among children in more than 95% of the cases. There are very few cases where the bequests are not really distributed equally. However, gifts are distributed very unequally between the children. So here a slide that shows across different countries, what is the average amount of gifts in 2004 euros. And this is the mean gift amount for those people who have given any gift. And then this is the mean gift amount. Like we look at the between and within group inequalities here. So just to understand whether there's any differences. And then any gift giving, this is the extensive margin binary, whether they give gift or not. So what we find is basically gift amounts vary dramatically across countries. And there's large differences between and within country differences, and between and within family differences as well, in terms of gift giving. And then we see the adult number of children in the sample sizes in the last column. So this gives us a chance to exploit this variation to see whether this variation produces more social contact in the similar way across the countries. That's the idea. So we'll take advantage of changes in inheritance tax legislations between 2004 and 2015 across the countries as an exogenous source of variation, which is not only across these within inequality, but also over time variations that we want to look at. For that reason, we went ahead and actually manually coded all the tax reforms in the data to see whether they are becoming more generous. Well, this is actually a charge concept, so we couldn't find a better one. I'm looking forward to hear your reactions. More generous towards the parents from the state, so they don't take away much of their money, but it might be less generous from the state point of view. So we use the term generous or stringent in terms of whether there's more money left for the families after taxes or less money left for the families after taxes. So we code them first, tax legislation changes towards becoming more generous towards the families, so less taxes. And then we estimate our results for those countries and for those changes. And then for a robustness check, we look at the tax legislation that became more stringent. And then do we see in the opposite direction the same estimations if they work? So that's kind of the idea of using the tax reforms. And we assume that the individuals face two choices. Either they give gifts now, seeing what the tax rate is, or decide gifting later so that they run the risk of bequesting at the end of their life. These choices will be affected by the treatment, which is the changes in the generosity of inheritance taxes to the individuals. So if the taxes are higher, that time, they might decide to give now rather than lose the taxes, or if the taxes are lower, they may decide to wait because who knows when people end their life, the end of life comes. So there's this inherent moral hazard that children not contacting after already receiving the gift at the full amount. So the parents have the strategic behavior to, we assume that, to give more smaller portions spreading over time until the end of their life. So there's also the other discussion that consumption smoothing literature in the economics that they say individuals would prefer to insure themselves against depleting their assets before the end of their lives. So they want to keep some of the money later so they don't fully give gifts at all. So we do think that these gift-giving behavior partially will respond to the taxation, and we'll show the results. And we argue that changes in inheritance taxes reduce or increase the value of future bequeathable wealth, which may generate incentives. And then we look at from the child's perspective, and then they see this is happening. And do they change their behavior in terms of social contact or not, depending on whether they receive more gift or not. So this is the complex story that I want to say. The entire identification strategy relies on what elderly parents will do in terms of taxation. But actually, entire our analysis rely on what adult children will do, seeing what parents will do, right? So I don't know whether it makes sense. Happy to take any questions if this is not clear, but because the entire analysis is based on that assumption. So what we do is basically then use a typical two-stage least square specification where we have the gifts are instrumented by the changes in inheritance taxes. And then they are, in the first stage, we show that they are related to gifts. In the second stage, we insert them in the second equation and then estimate the social contact. There is one problem with that kind of estimation, which I'll tell later. this is like this gift is a binary indicator that we use here, not the amount. So we use whether people give gift or not. And that's a nonlinear instrumental variable, which is very complicated to estimate in a two-stage least square. So blow up, very large coefficients come. So there are easy tricks and solutions. And then there's also an adverse regression treatment estimation, which is also called control function estimation. I do both, and I'll just skip the technicality. So we kind of fix that kind of functional form issues later. And I'll show the results in both ways. So the exclusion restriction here, the whole thing works because we think that gifts are affected by inheritance taxes, and then they only affect social contact through gifts and not through biggest expectations or anything else going on in the area. And our gift is a binary measure of any gift received by the child of value that is larger than 200 euros. That comes in the questionnaire in the data. We didn't set up this threshold. Social contact is children's social contact measured from a scale to 1, never, and 7 is daily. We don't have good quality information about the mode of social contact, whether that's phone, mobile, or anything else. So we just know that whether the contact is being daily or not. So at the moment, we look at the frequency of social contact. So this is the distribution of social contact. This is Bernheim's measures. That's like seminal papers that he published from 1980s to 2007, created a psychological scale of social contact from the same measurement. It's in a reverse coded. We also checked robustness, like using Bernheim measures, but it's like literally the same, like the same question, set of questions derive these two measures. And then we have another measure that looks at the people living further away and closer to the parents, more than 25 kilometers away or not. I'm not going to show the results on that today. So who gives gifts? So, well, basically you may ask, okay, rich people give gifts. Not everyone would give gifts more than 200 euros in a given year on the survey data. But we find that, sorry for the very ugly picture, not properly labeling this data graph. This basically shows that those who don't give gifts are here, where the 0 is labeled on top. Those who reported to have given any gifts, we wanted to look at the distribution of their wealth and see how wealthy those people are in terms of giving gifts. So there's this long tail in both cases. And then what we can assume is, so those people who have declared to have given gifts, on average, wealthier than those who have declared to not giving gifts. But then you can find across the wealth distribution both sides. So it's quite a variation in both groups, that those who give gifts and those who don't give gifts have rich and poor people in both categories. Right? So there's, yeah.
Yeah, but can I just
sure.
Because you're focusing here on financial wealth, I can see why, because it's a liquid asset, so easier to give gifts. But do you at all look at housing wealth? Of course, that varies between country, depending on differences in tenure, but also your hypothesis that once you give your gifts, then what's the incentive then for the children to maintain social contact in the same way? Now that's a lot harder, isn't it, with the house, which is usually split up. So there could still be an incentive for the social contact to get in the house.
That's an excellent question. I hope this is recorded, then I can remember, because I don't have it. This is an excellent question. So, like, to be honest, we haven't discussed that aspect much, but we do have the net worth variable, and that includes all sorts of assets. And then we looked at it among those people who have positive and high amount of net worth at different net worth quintiles, and then to see whether it makes a difference. But I think it might be useful for us to look at whether non-liquid assets, that they are expected to be giftable. And yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. So we wanted to show also our entire analysis relies on another assumption, which basically people don't pay taxes on gifts, right? So while they're paying taxes on inheritances, they shouldn't be paying taxes on gifts, so that their like logic and strategic behavior could work out. And we went again and then coded the countries where there's taxable threshold for gifts according to the tax codes, and then we mapped it onto our share data and to see how many observations that we would find whose gift amounts would be above the taxable threshold. And we find like predominantly zeros. There were a few cases here in Denmark and Netherlands, and then maybe 18 cases in, like in our very large sample sizes, like about 40,000 of observations that we find non-taxable anyway. Only very few, very large amounts of gifts could be taxable, but that's very hard to monitor or track unless they are like a transfer of the deed, like a housing asset or something else. So this gives us an assurance that gifts are not taxed, inheritance are taxed. And these are the changes that we have started coding for being generous versus stringent across the countries, looking at the tax legislations. Like, even though this table looks simple, it took us about a few weeks. 3 people tried to code these things because sometimes the tax rate has increased, but tax base is reduced. And sometimes tax base and tax rate both increase in a country. So we wanted to come up with meaningful senses that whether they become, on the whole, for majority, become more generous versus for the majority of the people that will become more stringent. So what we can say that like some countries abolished taxes and altogether reduced, and we have more cases of taxes being abolished. And then we have some countries that like allowances increased where the taxable threshold changed. So the increase in generosity were more common than the increase in stringency, which happened in Italy and which happened in, I think, Netherlands. So we use first generosity as an instrument to see how generous taxation affects people's behavior. And then we use stringency to see whether we observe the opposite behavior once we use the stringency. Okay, so I already talked about the data. I already said most of these things. I think the key thing is about our unit of analysis, our children, not the elderly parents. And then our sample size varies between 1,800 to 4,700 children, coming from approximately between 700 to 1,800 households across 11 countries in the first wave, and then we follow them over time. So what we do here is that we run basic OLS regressions in the first 3 columns by throwing out some country differences are controlled for, year fixed effects, and then household fixed effects, which I can discuss what household fixed effects means in this context. So we kind of eliminate all the observed and unobserved differences between the households to understand the relationship of gift giving versus contact is specific to the households, net of all these unobserved constant factors. So it's very weird to think about individual fixed effects where people do in this case, because this is a bilateral relationship. So you want to control for common factors, but like that are, you want to control, eliminate the factors that differ across the households, but you cannot think about the households when you are the children and then you might have siblings, and then you all have some social obligation to, or feel the obligation to look after the parents and have social contact with the parents. So household fixed effects doesn't protect us from thinking the differences between siblings and the needs between siblings, like who need to take turn in terms of doing social contact. What goes on within the household is not captured by it. So we do have in another specification, look at the individual fixed effects. And then we use these basic descriptive correlations, and then we look at the like instrumental variable estimations, all of them in the positive sign. So the gifts generate positive reactions in terms of social contact. The coefficients for IVs are blown up very large, and that's a control function fixed to these blown up coefficients because of nonlinearity. And the last column shows that more reasonable amount of increase in social contact, about 0.7 percentage point increases in the reported social contact. So this is our main results, but I will show now like variations, because people come up with, but what happens with grandchildren if it happens grandchildren? And then we say like, well, that's a good incentive. So in the absence of the financial transaction, elderly parents and the adult children might respond differently if there is grandchildren or not. So we wanted to split the sample to 3 groups, where in the first group, you look at those families with grandchildren, and another group, those families with there's no grandchildren, and what does the social contact looks like. And then we want to look at another sample like group of where there's grandchildren, but the grandparents do not provide any childcare to the grandchildren. It's just like a pleasurable contact. And in all cases that we see gift generating some social contact responses. So the coefficient sizes in compare the control function versions of it, more or less the same, and actually much larger when there's no grandchildren. And obviously, like social contact would respond to financial incentives more strongly when there's no grandchildren. When there's grandchildren, it's more natural to think about for both adult, like elderly parents, and also the incentives from the adult children that they want to have some generational contact between their children and the grandparents. So we don't know which ones trigger these relationships. So we would expect this coefficient to be larger on that group, and that's in the expected direction and expected sign. So we look at then what happens if the grandparents are not healthy. So the share data has provided health scores of the elderly parents. So then social contact becomes like an obligation or check up on the health of the grandparents, regardless of the financial status. This is a bit more tricky. So we focus on the healthy estimations, and then we look at only the sample of people where they declare that they're elderly parents, or the elderly parents themselves declare that their health status is good and very good. And in those categories, we see financial incentives work much larger than the other categories. And we wanted to look at the cases where there's presence of other siblings who then take turn and share the social contacts. And then they say like, okay, I have a brother in Germany. If he contacts daily with my parents, I can just get the Slack and then contact them maybe a weekly, like rather than daily. For those cases that we want to look at the presence of those siblings versus the only child, we can't look at the only child sample because those are far fewer among this generation. Like maybe in a few decades that we will be in the retirement age, there will be a lot of only child, but in this sample there were far fewer. And so we took them out and we looked at only siblings, and then the coefficient sizes gone up. Again, expected direction and expected size increase, because if you have someone to share with the social contact, if you think it as a burden, that you are more likely to respond financial incentives rather than moral incentives. So it's more likely to see these coefficients to be larger for that group. And also for the married versus unmarried children, where if the adult child has a family, his or her own, then they might be less focused on the attention to the parents or more. So we find them also in that positive sign. So we do think that across the board, gifts generate some social contact, and they are quite sizable in the setting. So we wanted to do some robust checks quickly to look at stepchildren, adopted children, and biological children. We do think that obligations, moral obligations, family obligations might be varying across these groups on average, right? So people are different places around the average, some may not. But you may argue that stepchildren might be responding to less to financial incentives as expected bequests or gift giving, or they may be receiving less gifts. Adopted children may be more, biological children may be somewhere in between. So we look at these differences. So we find that in the first stage results show that instrument is not significant for the sample of children. Is as expected, they don't respond to inheritance tax changes as strongly as the others. They may not think about, okay, I shouldn't really give it to the state and I should give them as a gift now. But we don't find the first stage there, so we can't really conclude much about the stepchildren, but we find very strong effects on the only biological children here. We don't find also the effects that gifts motive to be on the adopted children. The bigger picture here is that we see these stronger than these groups, gives us some sort of reassurance that are also in the expected direction. Parents use the contact and the children respond to it more likely when there's biological ties, probably. So we wanted to look at the reverse sign in if the states become more stringent in taxation rather than become more generous. And that would be then generating higher incentives to give the gifts. And then higher incentives giving gifts, does it generate more social contact? And then here on the column 6 that we find more or less in the same direction in the control function estimations, stringency also work by increasing gifts in our estimations. So that reassures us either becoming more generous reduces the gifts, and becoming more reduces the gift giving, and then generates a social contact response in the opposite direction, and then control function estimation of the system, like stringency, also gives us in the same direction, which is good. So our preliminary conclusions are basically that there's strong evidence across different samples that we cut the cake like among the healthy, unhealthy step biological or versus like different tax legislations that they're quite robust according to our view across these specifications, that gift giving or receiving gifts increases adult children's contact behavior with their elderly parents. And when we change the social contact measure to Bernheim measure, or if we want to look at the living distance further away from the parents, might generate similar reactions in our estimates. The people who live further away tend to have more social contact than the people are closer. I don't show those results here. So we find that with reasonable coefficient sizes, that financial incentives are there for most families for generating contact. So this is the last slide that I wanted to show, because this is very preliminary. I just finished these estimations last week, literally, where we want to look at whether the social contacts are more common for those people who live in the same building or who live away. So same building is defined, it can be the same flat or the same building upstairs, downstairs, or in a large building. And we find that social contacts are more likely to happen for those people who don't, like once we take out those who live in the same building, they are more likely to happen in a stronger coefficient size. So that's quite preliminary, and I finish here. Just wanted to say thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much.